Well, how do you know when you're looking for the decimal places and where the tenths, the hundredths, and the thousands are? And this is just a review of what we talked about earlier. And of course, it's according to the place. So instead of writing the denominator, we're just going to look for the decimal denominator place. And we're going to concern ourselves mostly in the early intermediate grades, which would be primarily 4th grade math, with just these first 3 places. If we master the first 3, the others are going to work right along as a pattern anyway. So do you know the name of the first one? Okay, remember the whole numbers are here. Here's the decimal point. Over here is decimal fraction land. So, first one is called the tenths. The second one is called hundredths, you're right. And the third one, thousandths. And on and on and on. Actually, once again, through infinity. Now, can you write in words this value? Now, it looks like 0.078, but if someone said read it and you said 0.078, you really wouldn't be reading its value. You'd just be telling what it looked like. Now, if you can read its value, and what you hear yourself read, either in your mind or out loud, if you write those words, then you'll have it. Okay, do you see yourself writing these words? 78 thousandths. Notice that THS on the end of it. That's 78, the numerator, down to the thousandths place. Writing it as a regular standard form fraction, it would look like this. The 78 at the top is the numerator, and the thousandths at the bottom. Notice how we don't have to write the thousands, we just put it in the thousandths place. Okay, once again, let's take a look at these 6. You might want to just see if you can pause the screen and work on this problem and come back and check your answers. Hopefully, even though the 6 number is quite different, you won't find it difficult. Okay, well, let's talk about the answer to this. We're going from largest to smallest. Well, these are interesting because one of them isn't even a fraction, and it's a whole number, and it's the simple whole number 1 whole. Now see, this is the only value that has a whole number in it. So obviously it's going to be bigger than all of these that are just fractional values. These are all part of 1, so they can't compare in size to 1 whole. So that's definitely first on the list. The second one would be this value, because after we eliminate 1 whole and we compare these fractions in the tenths place, well, 8 tenths is obviously has a greater value than what we see in the other places. Next would definitely come 0.6, 6 tenths. And next would come 302 thousandths. Why? Because it goes down to the thousandths place, but it has a 3 in the tenths place. And then next would be this one, nothing in the tenths place, but where it has 9 in the hundredths place, which is the next largest place, it's going to be larger than the last one that doesn't have anything in either the tenths or the hundredths place, and is just a small value, 4 1,000ths, 4 out of 1,000. That would be like 4 millimeters, wouldn't it? Okay, just a little check, and I know that if you haven't had much experience with the metric system and measuring with a meter stick, you may have a little bit difficulty with this still, but just a little bit of a reminder and a review. Okay, what decimal fraction of a meter is 1 millimeter? Remember there were 1,000? So 1 would be 1 1,000th, and that's how we'd write it as a decimal fraction. What decimal fraction of a meter is 36 centimeters? Well, each centimeter is 1 100th, so 36 of them must be 36 100ths. Now, this seems like a ridiculous question to some people, but I'll explain why it isn't. It's asking you to change 458 millimeters to a meter. Well, someone might say, well, I can't change that to meters because you need 1,000 millimeters to make 1 meter. Okay, but you're getting to be a big kid now, and your math is expanding. So you no longer have to think of things only making wholes. They can be fractions too. And seeing it takes 1,000 millimeters to make a meter, this is 458 out of 1,000, or 458 thousandths. I know that's a hard one. Maybe it makes sense. If it does, great. Now, most standard fractions are not expressed in the 3 digits that we talked about being in the decimal places, the tenths, the hundredths, the thousandths. Some are, but usually they're not. Now, these are the fractions that are standard fractions that you would need to be able to change into decimal fractions when you're starting this in 4th grade, early intermediate math. Okay, now you have to know your places. Of course, that's important. And you have to know that certain fractions, such as 1/2, that's the first fraction that we come to that isn't a decimal fraction, but can be changed into a decimal fraction. Because 1/2 can be changed to tenths if we make it into an equivalent fraction. Remember how we do it? 2 times 5 is 10, 1 times 5 is 5, and 5/10ths can be in the form of this decimal fraction by putting the 5 right in the tenths place. Now, at this particular grade level, if the first 3 decimal places, tenths, hundredths, and thousandths, cannot be divided by the denominator of a standard fraction that you're trying to change, then you will not be required to change it. Because there is a method for changing that. For instance, sevenths do not divide equally into 10 or 100 or 1,000. There is a way of doing it, which will be introduced later on, 5th or 6th grade math, in which you will be able to do this very simply by just following a procedure. But for now, we're going to stick with this concept, that if they don't divide equally into one of the decimal places, then you're not going to be required to change it. Halves are divisible into tenths, as we just saw before. 1/2 equals 5/10ths, and so therefore can be written as a decimal. Fifths are also divisible into tenths, as well as hundredths and thousandths, but we always take the first one we come to, a lot easier. Now, tenths doesn't require that you do any conversion. There's no change. If something is expressed as a standard fraction as tenths, remember we saw 3/10ths, that would simply be 0.3. Wouldn't have to worry about making any changes. 20ths can be changed into hundredths. You can go directly from hundredths to from 20ths to hundredths in equivalent fractions, so that can be done. 25ths can also be changed into hundredths because 100 is divisible by 25, and the same would work with 50ths. And of course, hundredths and thousandths already are in that form. Okay, let's see what we mean by that. Now, all of the decimal places that we deal with, and actually beyond what we deal with, are divisible by 2 and 5. They're all even, and they all end in 0. That's a couple of the clues for those 2 divisibilities. Hundredths and thousands are divisible by 2 and 5, as we said earlier, and 20ths and 25ths and 50ths. Okay, here's an illustration, a concrete illustration. If we are changing 3/5 into a decimal fraction, this would be the decimal fraction that it would be. If we didn't know that, we would have to change, first of all, to the standard fraction that has a denominator of tenths or hundredths or thousandths. Seeing we can go directly to tenths, and that's the smallest number, we do that. What's actually happening when we do that? Well, the fifths, when you change them to tenths, they get split in 2, and what used to be 5 parts make the whole, now we have doubled that, and we have 10 parts make the whole. That's why we're going to call them tenths now. That's what happens when you multiply that 5 times 2. You make 10 smaller pieces. And there they are. The shaded in section obviously is the 6/10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So what used to be called 3/5 as a standard fraction can be called 6/10 as a standard fraction, but that also has a form as a decimal fraction. Okay, any idea what decimal fraction 3/20 could change to? Well, if we take 3/20 and maybe just concentrate on that denominator first, the 20ths, we're not going to be able to change from 20ths to tenths unless we reduce it. And in 3/20 can't be reduced to tenths, because yes, we could divide 20 by 2 to get to 10, but 3 is not divisible by 2. So we need to go up to one of the higher places, and that would be hundredths, because 20 is directly divisible into 100. You know how we would do it. We would make a equivalent fraction. 20ths are going to change to hundredths. 20 times 5 is 100. 1 times 5 is 5. So 1/20th would equal 5 100ths. But the question was 3/20. Okay, that would be the same thing, wouldn't it? Except we're going to have a 3 at the top. 20 times 5 makes 100. 3 times 5 makes 15. So the conclusion is obvious. We just have to change that into a decimal form. And there it is. 15 100ths, when written as a decimal, is written as 0.15 with the 5 getting down to the hundredths place. Well, let's try these. Now you can try them by yourself and come back for the explanation. Or if you want, just wait for the explanation and see if you can follow along in your mind. Okay, this first one is 7/25. What I'm thinking to myself is that 25 is divisible into 100, which is the next denominator. We have tenths. We're not going to divide 10 by 25, but hundredths, that can be done. If we were to do that, we would change to 28 hundredths. Now, if you don't quite see how I did that, let's take a look at the next one, and I'll show you in this little box what actually goes on behind the scenes here. Okay, we want to change 13/50ths, obviously, into hundredths, because 100 is divisible by 50. The answer would be that, but this is how you get it. First of all, 13/50ths must be changed into an equivalent fraction that has hundredths as the denominator. Well, that would mean multiplying the 50 times 2 and the 13 times 2. Now we would have a fraction in the hundredths place, 26 hundredths. All you do then is turn around and write it as a decimal. How about 4/5? Well, think about getting to the tenths place. With 5 times 2 is 10, and 4 times 2 would be 8/10. So once again, the same procedure. First of all, change it to a standard fraction that has a denominator that is one of the decimal denominators, and this is the first one, tenths. So now it's just a matter of writing it as a decimal fraction. So that's really pretty straightforward. First, change it to a denominator that is in the decimal fraction category, and you only have to worry about tenths, hundredths, and thousandths, and then just rewrite it. Okay, 1/20th, remember we just had that one. That would be 0.05, because 1/20th, 20 times 5 is 100, 1 times 5 is 5, and that goes into the hundredths place, and we hold the tenths place with a 0. Now this one, if you look closely at, it's a little bit of a trick. You don't have to do any changing. It's just saying 27 thousandths. Okay, put 27 in the thousandths place. Okay, get it down to the thousandths place, and when you do that, you get the 7 in the thousandths place. 20 thousandths is 2 100ths, and we don't have any tenths in this case.